All right, very good. So if I recall correctly, we looked at the third Mishnah in the third chapter. Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion, two people who sit need to study Torah together, right? We looked at that.
I don't remember looking at that one. I thought we looked at two.
Blue,
and that was
Blue says that he remembers.
You remember it? Oh my goodness. Getting old.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh.
All right. So the idea being that the Shekhinah, the divine presence, is hovers between the people as they engage together in studying Torah and speaking words of Torah to each other, and God is, as it were, listening in to what each of these people are doing. And then at the end, he says, and not only if it's a bunch of people, 3 people, 2 people, even one person who has nobody else to study with, they're just studying on their own, quietly sitting there. God is so appreciative, and God takes note of this as well. So the idea that maybe there's a little bit of a difference, that the divine presence is a little more manifest when there's the give and take between people. It's beautiful, it's important, it's holy for every person to learn Torah as much as they can, whenever they can, wherever they can. But it's great when you can get together with somebody else. That's a quantum leap. There's a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative difference in how many people are studying, but studying together brings God's presence so much more strongly. So now we're going to go to the next Mishnah, right? So in my numbering, it's Mishnah 4, Mishnah Daled, and in different editions, the previous Mishnah could have been part of the previous Mishnah also. So it's either 2 or 3 or 4. So we're at Mishnah 4. Rabbi Shimon says, yeah, Josie, what?
I'm sorry, Lou. I don't think we did that chapter. But anyhow, the very end of chapter 3 applies to 1 as well as 2. Let one sit in solitude and be still, for he will have received a reward for doing so. Does that mean without studying, just sitting?
No, that means studying on your own.
Okay.
Even though there's nobody else to study with, so there's nobody else to yell at and go, we did do this Mishnah. No, we did not do this Mishnah.
Yeah, right.
All of that back and forth. So if you're just, plugging along on your own, nevertheless, God takes, full appreciation of what you're doing, and loves the fact that you're studying Torah.
Thank you.
That's the end there. So now we're on the next mission. Okay. So Rabbi Shimon, and who's going to read for us this morning? Okay, Geraldine, quick with the hand. Good.
Rabbi Shimon taught, 3 who dine at a table and do not exchange words of Torah are considered as having eaten of idolatrous sacrifices, as it is written, for all the tables are filled with vomit and filth when God is absent. However, 3 who dine at a table and exchange words of Torah are considered as having eaten at God's table, as it is written, and he spoke to me. This is the table before the Lord.
Okay. So we've gone from a general discussion of people should get together and study Torah with each other. And now we have a very specific context, the table where we eat. And Rabbi Shimon says that this is also a place of Torah. So we had the translation that you offered, and Josie is with us. So Josie, do you have that available? Do you have Rabbi Shapiro's translation? You have to unmute.
Yes.
Good.
Rabbi Shimon teaches, if 3 eat together and share no Torah, theirs is a feast for idols. Hence it says, without God, all tables are full of vomit and filth. But if 3 eat together and share Torah, theirs is a feast with God. Hence it says, and he said to me, This is God's table.
Okay, so a pretty close translation. I haven't heard any radical differences between those translations. So, okay, anybody want to chime in? If anybody's eating, so this could be like a virtual table that we're all sitting at. Okay, so all right, so Geraldine wants to, there you are. Sarita's making this into a table. We have to say some words of Torah now. Okay, so we'll go around. Geraldine will speak. Who else wanted to speak? Sarita wanted to speak. Who else? Josie wants to speak. Okay, good. So go ahead, Geraldine.
This always reminds me of the first time when you first came to Shomrei, and after Minyan on Sunday morning, we went out to have breakfast at the table. And as soon as we sat down, you had us talk to us about something from Torah. And that always reminds me of it whenever we would sit down at the table. That's all I wanted to say.
All right, good. Good memories. Yeah, Sarita.
I'm just wondering, does this mean like, sort of study, or is this referring more broadly to eating without saying a blessing?
Okay, good question. Let's hold off on that. Good question. Yeah, Josie.
Mine is the follow-up, because I think of all those people who eat in the days when we had a big kiddush lunch, but they duck out before the prayers at the end. So does this include that kind of prayer?
Right, so that sort of follows together with Sarita's point. What kind of Torah words are we talking about? What are we looking for here? So in the Hebrew, there's a little bit of a difference between the previous Mishnah and this Mishnah in the way that it talks about what should be happening among the three people. In the previous Mishnah, Rabbi Hanania ben Tradion says that when people are sitting together, ve'ein beineihem divrei Torah, or ve'yesh beineihem divrei Torah, there are words of Torah between them. In other words, there's an exchange of words of Torah. People are having a conversation. They're having a give and take between them. Then God's presence is there. With Rabbi Shimon, we have something else. But before we get to what Rabbi Shimon says, I want to bring up maybe another question for us, and I think it all fits in the end. Why is he specifically focusing on the table? What's the big deal about the table? I mean, and why isn't what he says just included in what we had in the previous Mishnah, which says three people together should have, study Torah. So this is going to lead us a little bit into this discussion about what kind of Torah we're talking about. Jen.
Well, the table is where we gather usually 3 times a day, often with family, sometimes with friends. So it's like a daily thing that we're doing all the time. So it's a major part of our lives. So it'd be hard to, we can have lots of days where we don't do other things or don't get together with friends, but it's very few days that we're not eating.
So I mean, 3 times a day sounds really good. I think that's, you're very lucky if that's your experience. Eating and being at a table may not be the same thing for a lot of people, especially in today's rushed environment. To sit down
possibly
together.
not when he was writing, though. Even I would imagine at
when
least
he was
twice
writing,
a day.
You bet it was twice a day. Yeah, it wasn't 3 times a day. Sarita, yeah.
I'm just wondering, I think about, part of the sacrament.
Now I can't hear you. I got it.
When we were giving sacrifices, part of that, depending on the kind of sacrifice, involved eating, right, and sharing food. So I'm wondering if this ties into that.
Yes, so that's absolutely correct. We just finished building, Lou.
I'm not sure the time frame here, but is this an allusion to the Shulchan Aruch?
The Shulchan Aruch is approximately, I would say, 1,400 years later. So, but we talked about the Shulchan Aruch yesterday, as you know, during services. So Yes, the Shulchan Aruch is also a kind of an allusion to Psalm 23. Ta'aroch lifanai shulchan. You set a table before me, despite my enemies. Right. So, so the Shulchan Aruch, we talked about it yesterday as having a connection to the Mishkan elements, paraphernalia. There is a table in the Mishkan, and the Mishkan is finally set up and everything at the end of yesterday's Torah reading. And then next week, God willing, we will begin reading about what you do in the Mishkan, which is the sacrifices mostly. So by the time we're here, time frame wise, we are approximately 60, 70 years after the temple has been destroyed. So there is no temple. And what the task of the Jewish people was at that point was to respond to that gigantic void that was created with the disappearance of the center of their religious system. Whatever you did at home, whatever you did, there was plenty of things to do. There's a lot of the Torah that each Jew has to observe. But nevertheless, the temple was the center, the official center of the entire Jewish people, and it wasn't there anymore. So what do you do when that void happens? So one answer was, well, that means that it's all over, and we have to find some substitute. And that's what Christianity's answer is. The Jews who decided that this was therefore the end of a nice chapter. We had a good run, and now it's time to do something else and find a different way to approach God. Those Jews initiated a process that was then embraced, throughout the world, of creating a religious life that has echoes of the Jewish past, but then goes beyond it and doesn't see the necessity to keep it going per se. The Jews that didn't do that, those are our teachers and our spiritual parents. The Jews that decided we have to figure out how to keep on doing Jewish, even though we don't have a temple, those are the people who kept Judaism going. And there are various elements to the responses that were created. This rabbinic, array of stuff is the product of that concerted response. So one of the things was we don't have the temple, but we have the Torah. So we have to double down on studying Torah, on interpreting the Torah, on making the Torah meaningful in everyday life. And we'll study about the sacrifices even when we can't do the sacrifices. Another response was creating the synagogue. Synagogues probably already started while the temple was in existence, because not everybody could get to the temple. But the synagogue experience that was happening until the temple was destroyed was very secondary to the temple itself. So the synagogue was a place of meeting. It was a little bit more of a JCC. It was basically in a pension. That's why we make Kiddush Friday night in shul when we have a minyan, because people would know that there's if there's a Jewish community, that means that they can get a place to sleep at night if they're traveling. And Kiddush Friday night was made because there were people that were assumed to be sleeping in the synagogue and spending Shabbat there. So they were going to have a meal. So the idea of the synagogue in its full development that we have today, a house of prayer and study and schooling and other ways of being a center for the Jewish community, that grew much, much more and flourished because we needed it once there was no temple. And another place that we decided we're going to continue the temple heritage, even though we don't have a temple, is the home. So the Jewish home became also enhanced in its significance as a place where Jewish practice needed to be reinforced. And the rabbis taught that the table that you have in your home is the replacement or the continuation of the altar that once existed in the temple. So that idea that the table that you have is a sacred place, as Jen said, and we're going to get it later. If you don't eat, then forget about all the spiritual stuff. You're just going to, if you starve to death, then there's nothing to talk about, right? You need to live. You need to be physically capable of doing stuff. So food is just plain old necessity. But we enhanced the experience of eating food in a number of ways. In the temple times, the focus was on purity laws, right? Kashrut, certain things you couldn't eat, certain things you could. That was a given. That starts from the Torah itself. But then there was the idea of eating food in purity. You didn't have to eat food in purity except in the temple. So purity is only an issue in the temple itself. Once the temple was destroyed, so some people said, you know what, we want to continue the system of purity in some fashion, even in our own homes. We wash our hands with that cup before we bless the bread as a way of continuing laws of purification, right? Even though it's not really, we are fundamentally impure in many ways because we don't have the mechanisms of the temple to purify ourselves. But we go through those, literally go through the motions and purify our hands, take our hands in hand with a purification ritual rather than just soap and water, right? It's not about cleaning your hands so that they're not dirty. In fact, that's taken for granted. You can't purify your hands with the cup if your hands are dirty. So you have to first wash your hands with soap, make sure that your hands are okay, clean, and then you do that extra step of purifying your hands so that when you take the bread, you're taking the food, you're not rendering the food impure. Okay, so this is, a very, very on one foot kind of thing. The blessing system, Sarita mentioned before, that's also part of this ongoing system of enhancing our religious consciousness despite the loss of the temple. So creating blessings was a joint effort by the public, by Jewish people all over the place, and by the rabbis. The rabbis sort of like codified it and got it organized and affirmed the need for blessings and created blessings and accepted the blessings that other people were creating, rejected other blessings that some people would suggest. But they ended up creating a whole system of saying blessings when we do a mitzvah, but also saying blessings when we eat, before and after, right? So the idea was that we're sandwiching. Every piece of food that we eat is a sandwich, right? It's the stuffing of a sandwich, and it's a blessing sandwich. There's a blessing, there's a slice of blessing before or on top, and a slice of blessing underneath, and the food is in the middle. So you could see that as being one way to say words of Torah at the table. So it's not necessarily that you have to, get hot and heavy into a real discussion about some difficult issue in the Torah, but to bring the Torah to the table. So in fact, the Hebrew for this Mishnah, this teaching of Rabbi Shimon, says if there were three people who ate al shulchan echad, right? At one table or upon one table. Velo amru alav divrei Torah, and they did not say upon it words of Torah. What's upon it? Upon it is the table, right? So this is not about the fact that they're engaged between themselves. In the first Mishnah, it says, if there's no Torah between the two people, the three people, the group that's there, the Torah there is flying back and forth between the people. Here, it's to say words of Torah onto the table, upon the table, to recognize that that's where we are, and that the table as a holy place of meeting, it's not just where we satisfy our animal needs, but our physical needs, but it's also a place that we can transcend our physical desires and urges and bring them into a realm of sanctity. So that's what every blessing is supposed to be. And that's part of what this is saying. So that table needs to have some acknowledgement that the table itself is a place of God's presence. So that's then when we read the verses that they bring, they're pretty stark verses, right? The verse says, all those tables are full of vomit and feces, right? Without any room. So the literal translation is without any room. They're so full, they're piled up with this stuff. There's no room for anything else except the vomit and the feces. The rabbis made a pun from that verse, and they say, Bali makom, without any room. Makom is a name for God. So this morning I was just, unfortunately, at the Halbfinger Shiva, and we said to the family, Hamakom yenachem etchem. May God, who is the place, give you consolation. So makom is a name for God. In the Seder, we say Baruch Hamakom, Baruch Hu, Baruch Shenatan Torah le'amo Yisrael. Right? Blessed be the place, Hamakom, blessed be the one who gave the Torah to the people of Israel. So Hamakom is a name that the rabbis used. It's not a meaning in the Torah itself. God says, I have place with me. When Moses asks God after the golden calf episode, Moses says, let me see your glory. How do I know that you really love me? God says, Hinei makomiti. I have some room here with me for you to be with me, right? I'll take care of you. So, but it's the rabbis who made the makom not just something that God has, but a name for God. So they read that verse, therefore, as without makom, without God's presence at the table, then the greatest, most amazing banquet, the beautiful delicacies, the most exquisite kinds of presentation and so on, it's all literally crap without God's presence. So yeah, I think it's very unfortunate when people take the announcement of benching at Shomrei as the signal for them to leave. It's not like it takes 3 hours. So we do a shortened version. To make that kind of conscious choice to say this activity is not just a social activity, animals socialize too. It's not just a hunger satisfying activity, but it also is an activity that we should acknowledge that we are this miraculous mixture of physical and spiritual. And we need to acknowledge the source of that spiritual being. Yeah, Sarita.
So here it refers to when 3 people are the number 3. So does this only apply to 3 and up? Because the first verse talks about 2 people getting together. So what's the significance of that?
So the significance there is what we do at the end of the meal when we do a zimun. Will you lead us in the benching? I say to somebody.
Right.
Will you? So what happens there is we call out to each other. One person calls out, Chaverai nivarech, my friends, or Rabotai, my teachers, my mentors. Nivarech, let's bless, right? And then what do we say? We respond. whoever's there is, we respond. Yehi Shem Hashem Evorach. We
Couldn't two
mention
people do that?
So two people don't do that, three people do that. So that's what you need. This is a Talmudic discussion. The verse pictures one person calling out and two people responding, at least. And then, of course, if it's more, that's even better. And if it's 10, then we have the classic idea that we have a minion and we can do even more. So that's the discussion, and that's what this is alluding to. So this is the three people who can, and back to your point, who can place God's name upon the table. Jen.
So does this mean that it is what it's referring to the bracha we say before and the benching afterwards, and in between we can talk about Jeopardy and not get in trouble with this particular
Not too much.
rabbi.
Don't get into arguments. Don't get into any. Yes, yeah, have a good time. Have yes, we're not Savaranola. We're not like trying to like completely destroy everybody's enjoyment of life. We're trying to add to it. Right? We're trying to say enjoy life, but then understand where that enjoyment ultimately is being fed from, literally. Right? Yeah. The words actually that are here, this terrible condemnation. We have, and again in the Hebrew. So we have. What was it, Geraldine, when you read the translation? Three who eat on the table on one table. Can
Three
you
who dine at a table and do
dining
not
even? Yeah, very good. Okay, this is fancy. Yeah.
and do not exchange words of Torah are considered as having eaten of idolatrous sacrifices.
Okay, so the translation you have is idolatrous sacrifices, and that's the translation that Rabbi Shapiro gives us.
A feast for idols.
Right. So they're talking about idols. The literal translation again is sacrifices of the dead. Right? Zivchei meitim. Right. And of course, it's alluding to idols, but it really has that, idol, it could be a name of a TV show. This is, it's supposed to punch you a little bit into the stomach. Right. This is what you're eating. No matter, again, like I said, no matter how fancy and delicious, it's a sacrifice to the dead. It's a sacrifice of the dead, right? And then the verse that's very extreme in its disgustingness. If you look back at the origin of that verse in Yeshayahu, it's talking about priests and sages who have betrayed God.
Ooh.
So this is God complaining that here you were supposed to be serving me, and instead you abandoned me. So now this is being applied not just to these, the elite rulers and spiritual elite, but to every single person. Every single person is expected to go the other way. And then the last verse, which is the confirming and positive verse, says that, right? And God said to me, this is a table that is before me, before the eternal, before God, right? This table counts for me, gives me nachas. This is the same kind of table as in the temple. Where do you think this verse comes from? It comes from Ezekiel, and it's talking about the altar. It's talking about the temple altar. Ezekiel has a vision of the next temple to be built. Ezekiel lived right after the destruction of the first temple. And his vision is that God says there will be another temple, and that temple will be, glorious and so on. He describes all kinds of things about the temple. And then that altar will be restored. So he's theoretically talking about the specialized sacrificial altar, but the rabbis take it and say that future, vision of a temple, what do we do about it now? It's my table and your table. And that's the table that God wants to be God's table as well. There's a classic book by now for people who are planning a bar and bat mitzvah. And it's called Putting God on the Guest List, right? So, the party, that you're inviting everybody to, is God going to be there too? So that's what's mentioned here. Okay. Oh, we went way over. I'm sorry. Okay. Zeig is in. Gotta run.